President Trump just detonated Washington with a threat so explosive it sent impeachment papers rushing through Congress in real time. A sitting president publicly targeting a federal judge, calling them a traitor, demanding consequences, and within hours, Capitol Hill went into absolute chaos. Republicans and Democrats both saying this crosses every line of power, every boundary of democracy, every protection meant to keep judges safe from political invasion. And now the truth is spilling out fast. Security alerts, congressional panic, a full-blown constitutional meltdown. Because if this threat stands, if this attack goes unanswered, then everything collapses next. And here's the part nobody's ready for.
Tonight, those affected by President Trump's federal funding freeze have a little longer to clear up confusion over the order. A federal judge has temporarily halted it. Earlier today, top Senate Democrat Chuck Schumer sharply criticized the action.
This decision is lawless, it's destructive, it's dangerous, it's cruel, it's illegal, and it's unconstitutional. Donald Trump has done a lot of bad things in the last week, but nothing's worse than this.
Let's bring in two reporters who know a little bit about all this to discuss it a little more. Nancy Cook, a senior national political correspondent for Bloomberg News, and Julie Grace-Brufke is a senior political correspondent for the Daily Beast, joining us from Doral, Florida, where House Republicans are meeting behind occasionally opened but mostly closed doors about the future as they prepare for some big legislation later this year. Earlier today at the White House, the new press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, defended this federal aid freeze. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
I think this is a very responsible measure. Again, the past 4 years, we've seen the Biden administration spend money like drunken sailors. It's a big reason we've had an inflation crisis in this country, and it's incumbent upon this administration to make sure, again, that every penny is being accounted for honestly.
I get the drunken sailor spending bit, but Julie Grace, you're there with all of them in Florida. Is there sufficient support for what they pulled today among congressional Republicans?
Well, I've spoken to a number of lawmakers today, and there still seems to be some confusion to the scope of what it's going to affect. And there's definitely some concerns among moderates about what it would do to programs like Medicare.
Tonight, we're watching a president test the limits of American democracy in real time, when the person who swore an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution starts using their platform to attack judges and label elected officials as traitors who deserve punishment. That's not just another toxic news cycle. That's a direct shot at the rule of law itself. I want to be really clear about what this episode is actually about. Yes, it's about Trump's latest explosive comments. Yes, it's about talk of impeachment. But underneath all of that, the core question is simple. Do we still have a justice system that can stand up to political bullies? Or are we sliding into a world where whoever controls the presidency gets to threaten judges into submission? Because in a real democracy, no one is above the law doesn't just apply to protesters or poor people or some random guy who gets pulled over. It applies to the president. It applies most of all to the people with the most power. And what we're seeing right now is a president who clearly does not believe that. Let's slow this down and walk through what's been happening, because the pattern is the story. Over the last months, Trump hasn't just complained about biased judges or bad rulings, the way politicians always do. He's gone much further. He singled out specific judges by name, called them radicals, said they're part of a political witch hunt, and openly suggested that they should be punished or removed from the bench because they ruled against him. That's already crossing a line. Presidents disagree with courts all the time, but there's a huge difference between saying, "I think this ruling is wrong," and telling millions of your followers that a particular judge is an enemy of the people, a traitor, someone who deserves consequences. The first is criticism, the second is intimidation. On top of that, you've got him and his allies tossing around impeachment like it's a toy. Not impeachment of a corrupt official who took bribes, not impeachment of a judge caught breaking the law, but impeachment as punishment for judges who dare to enforce constitutional limits on presidential power. He doesn't like a ruling? Suddenly that judge is corrupt, and there are people in Congress floating impeachment resolutions on cable news.
funding for Meals on Wheels or for school lunch programs or things like that. I mean, there's got to be a real scare among some of them. Does that have the potential to force the president, the White House, to pull back and change course?
Well, I think that they just didn't have a ton of answers about all of the programs affected. And we saw that in the first White House briefing today by Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. You know, she kept emphasizing that benefits that go directly to people like Medicare and Social Security aren't affected. But there's a ton of benefits that do flow through states like Medicaid or through nonprofits that then flow to people like Meals on Wheels. And there's just a real lack of clarity about sort of how the sweep of this federal funding freeze and you know, what it actually looks like.
Julie Grace, you are, as we said, in Doral. They're holding these meetings at Trump Doral, which has a handful of golf courses and a club or two, and certainly enough conference space for all of the House Republicans. What has been on their agenda? What's the purpose of these meetings, and what are we expecting them to come back to Washington having discussed?
No, so today they met with J.D. Vance, who kind of called for all of them to unify together, and particularly with this reconciliation bill coming up. So they're kind of trying to hash out what they could get in there as they look to extend the Trump tax cuts, roll back regulations on energy, deal with border legislation, all of this one bill that they're kind of looking to put together here. That being said, there's some moderates that are kind of temping down expectations, saying they don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, but they're hoping to be able to get some things done. But there are still some disagreements with the Freedom Caucus on things like how to handle the debt ceiling and some other critical things that they need to tackle there as part of their agenda.
One of those critical things is so-called state and local taxes, or SALT, as it's known to those of us from the Northeast. And there's been a lot of focus on that, Nancy, as House Republicans try to reach this compromise on cutting spending, but also maybe restoring some tax credits for people who pay higher property taxes. To what extent do we think this was coming up in Florida and potentially muddies their ability to reach some kind of...
And then, layered on that, you have Trump using language that isn't just angry or partisan, but dangerous. Calling lawful actions by lawmakers seditious, talking about behavior being punishable by death, throwing that phrase out to a base that has already shown it's willing to act on his anger. We all remember what happened when he told supporters the election was stolen and that they needed to fight like hell. Words aren't abstract with this guy. They have a body count. So when that kind of rhetoric gets directed at judges and at members of Congress, we're not just talking about mean tweets. We're talking about a sitting president using his megaphone to paint targets on the backs of people whose job is to check his power. That goes to the heart of why impeachment even exists as a constitutional tool. The framers of the Constitution were naive. They didn't assume every president would be a saint. They just fought a war against a king. They understood exactly what unchecked power looks like. So they built in this emergency exit. If a president abuses his office, if he uses the power of the presidency to undermine the system itself, Congress can step in and say, "You're done." That's what high crimes and misdemeanors is really about. Not just criminal statutes, but betrayals of the public trust. And honestly, I don't know what could be a bigger betrayal than trying to scare judges into ruling in your favor. Think about what judicial independence is, in practical terms, not just as a phrase. It means that when you go into court, whether you're a billionaire, a homeless person, or a president, the judge is supposed to look at the law and the facts, not at your social media following, not at your polling numbers, not at what you might say about them afterwards. If you strip that away, if you make judges worry that ruling the wrong way could unleash a torrent of threats and harassment from the president's supporters, then ordinary people lose their last resort. It's not just Trump's opponents who are at risk. It's anyone who ever needs a fair hearing against a powerful person or a powerful institution. And you can already see how this pressure is landing. Judges have been talking publicly, which they almost never do, about the spike in threats since Trump began attacking them by name. Security has been increased around courthouses. U.S. Marshals are getting more cases. Families of judges are being doxxed. This isn't theoretical. It's not some law school seminar. It's real people in black robes and their kids and their spouses, suddenly living with that knot in their stomach because the president decided they're a convenient punching bag. When that becomes the backdrop for talk of impeachment, we're not normal politics anymore. We're in a constitutional stress test. Can our institutions hold up when the person who is supposed to faithfully execute the laws is actively trying to intimidate the people who interpret those laws? Now, some people are going to say, well, what about free speech? Doesn't the president have the right to criticize judges? Of course he does. Everyone has the right to criticize government officials, including judges. That's not the issue. The issue is power and intent. When an ordinary citizen tweets that they think a judge got it wrong, that's free speech. When the president, with the full weight of the office behind him, calls a judge a traitor and hints that they deserve punishment, that's something else entirely. A president isn't just some guy with a phone. His words carry the force of the office. They signal to federal agencies, to his supporters, to anyone in his orbit, what's acceptable and what's not. If he uses that megaphone to encourage accountability, that's one thing. If he uses it to threaten people, especially people involved in overseeing his own legal exposure, that can absolutely cross into abuse of power and obstruction of justice. And that's exactly why there are serious voices calling for impeachment in response to this kind of behavior. Not because they like the word impeachment, not because it polls well, but because they're looking at a pattern. Attack the elections, attack the peaceful transfer of power, attack the press, attack prosecutors, and now attack the judges who are handling his cases and the lawmakers who warn the military about unlawful orders. There's a straight line there. We've seen this movie before in different forms. First, impeachment, pressuring a foreign government to manufacture dirt on a political rival, leveraging public money for personal gain. Second, impeachment, inciting a mob to storm the Capitol to stop the certification of an election. Each time, the story has been the same. Trump using his power not to serve the country, but to serve himself, even if that means shattering norms and endangering people. This new phase, turning the presidency into a platform for threats against judges and lawmakers, fits perfectly into that pattern. It's the same instinct. If someone stands between him and what he wants, they become an enemy who must be destroyed, not just argued against. Now, I know there are folks who are exhausted by the word impeachment. It feels like we've been living in that conversation forever. But ask yourself this: if what's happening right now doesn't rise to the level of an impeachable abuse of power, what does? What's the point of having that tool if you're never allowed to use it when a president is actively undermining the branch of government that's supposed to keep him in check? And this is bigger than Trump, because every time we let a line be crossed without consequences, we're writing a new script for future presidents. If this president can get away with calling judges traitors and hinting at death for lawmakers who disagree with him, then the next president can go a little further. Maybe the one after that starts talking openly about defying court orders. Maybe we wake up one day and realize the courts still exist on paper, but everyone knows they're too scared to actually constrain the executive. You don't have to look far around the world to see what that looks like. In country after country, the first moves of would-be strongmen are the same. Attack the press, pack the courts, intimidate the judges, and rewrite the rules to keep themselves safe and in power. It's the same playbook every time. We're not special. We're not immune. The only thing that stops that slide is people in positions of authority saying no while they still can. Congress is one of those positions. Members of Congress swear an oath too, not to a party, not to a person, but to the Constitution. And that oath doesn't just cover the days when it's easy. It covers the moments when doing the right thing is politically risky, when it means standing up to a leader who still has a passionate base and a threatening presence. For Republicans especially, this is a gut check moment. You cannot campaign on law and order and back the blue and respect the courts, then turn around and shrug when your party's leader is attacking judges and floating language about treason and death for people who check him. You can't tell voters you want a country of laws, not men, and then treat one man as above the law because you're scared of his supporters. And for Democrats, the challenge is different but just as serious. They can't just treat this as another opportunity for spicy headlines. If they want to talk about impeachment, it has to be grounded in a sober, clear explanation of why this is about the system, not just about settling scores with a man they've opposed for years. They have to make the case that defending judges from political threats isn't partisan, it's patriotic. All of this might sound very abstract, very inside baseball, but it isn't. If you've ever had to fight your insurance company in court, if you've ever relied on a judge to protect you from an abusive ex, if you've ever watched a civil rights case that made your life a little freer, you have benefited from judges not being afraid to rule against powerful interests. That's what's on the line here. Not some ivory tower concept of judicial independence, but the everyday reality that someone neutral can stand between you and the people who have more money, more influence, or more weapons than you do. So when we talk about impeachment in this context, we're not just talking about punishing one man. We're talking about whether we still value that basic protection enough to defend the people who provide it. Removing a president from office is the most extreme step our system allows that doesn't involve violence. It's supposed to be rare. It's supposed to be hard. But it's also supposed to be real, a real deterrent, a real consequence, not just a word we throw around when we're mad. Here's when things stand, big picture. We have a president who has repeatedly shown contempt for any limit on his power. We have a judiciary that is already under physical and political pressure. We have a Congress that is nervous, divided, but hearing louder and louder arguments that this behavior can't go unanswered. And we have a public that has been so battered by constant outrage that it's tempting to tune all of this out as just more noise. That temptation is understandable, but it's dangerous. Because authoritarianism doesn't arrive all at once with a marching band. It creeps in, one unprecedented act at a time, until the unprecedented becomes the new normal. One day, it's a president calling a judge a radical. The next day, it's a president hinting they're a traitor. Then it's suggesting they deserve punishment. Then it's someone in the president's orbit saying, well, who's really going to stop him? The answer to that question is supposed to be, we are. Our institutions are. Our representatives are. And impeachment, as heavy and dramatic as it is part of that answer when the president himself is the problem. So as talk of impeachment grows louder around Trump's threats and his rhetoric about judges and lawmakers, don't let anyone convince you this is just politics as usual. There's nothing usual about a commander-in-chief who treats independent judges like enemies of the state. There's nothing normal about dabbling in death penalty language against elected officials who are doing their duty. That's not toughness. That's not strength. That's fear and rage dressed up as patriotism. At some point, this country has to decide what it values more, one man's ego or the fragile system that protects all of us when our rights are on the line. If we still believe in the idea that law is supposed to be stronger than any one person, then there have to be consequences when the most powerful person in the country uses his office to threaten the very people tasked with applying that law. And if we're not willing to enforce those consequences, if impeachment is always too divisive, too extreme, too soon, no matter what a president does, then we should at least be honest with ourselves. We should stop pretending we still live in a system where no one is above the law. Because a system that won't hold its own leader accountable for attacks on judges and lawmakers isn't a system of laws anymore. It's just a stage for whoever can shout the loudest. But that's the crossroad we're at right now. On one side, a president who treats every check on his power as an enemy to be crushed. On the other, a constitution that only works if enough people in Congress, in the courts, and in the public are willing to say, no, you don't get to do that. The choice between those two isn't theoretical. It's playing out in hearings, in speeches, in late-night phone calls on Capitol Hill. And however you feel about Trump personally, however tired you are of the word impeachment, that choice matters to you. Because the message we send in this moment about what is and isn't acceptable from a president is going to echo long after he's off the stage. The stakes aren't just about him. They're about the next president and the one after that, and whether the phrase independent judiciary still means anything when your rights are on the line. So yes, the impeachment conversation is back. Not because people love drama, but because the president has once again dragged us to a place where we have to ask the hardest question our system allows. Is this behavior compatible with the oath of office or not? And if the answer is no, then the tools the Constitution gives us can't just sit on a shelf.